hearty welcome to everybody. It's our annual discussion forum, Talking Points 2021, and we're going to be looking back over the year, be looking ahead a little bit as well. We had a tremendous reception to last year's discussion at Nicholas Mee and Company, and what we'd like to do this time is we've got a couple of new guests. We're going over some of the things that have happened this year and looking forward to what could be happening and points to talk about. It's a free-ranging discussion, so we'll see where we go. First of all, I'd like to introduce you to one of our guests. James Knight has been head of Bonhams Motoring. He's now an independent consultant, still very much a man with his finger on the pulse of Aston's. He's the familiar face at the Bonhams auctions for all these years. A man who's sold more auctions, I think, from the rostrum than just about anybody else. We've also got Charles Clegg, who is an Aston man, and his father is an Aston family, and he's now working in a very interesting area on looking after your cars, curating your collection, which you'll be telling us a little bit about. Neal, we all know, commercial director of Nicholas Mee and Company. He'll know what's been happening at the cutting edge of the market, who's buying what, who isn't buying what, what's selling and what isn't. And last but not least, owner and founder, the man who puts his name on the front door, Nicholas Mee. Nick's been in the business a long time. So I think between the four of us, and perhaps me chipping in every now and again, we should have an interesting discussion this year. So perhaps starting with Nick, what's been the highlight, do you think, of 2021? What have you seen that's been happening?
Well, it's been a bit of a topsy-turvy year, isn't it, really? If you think about it, with the lockdown earlier in the year, coming out of a COVID process and so on, and also with now we are very firmly out of the EU, the ramifications of being out of that trading community with tax and so on and so forth. So it's been a very interesting year, but behind it all, what's perhaps most interesting is the amount of business activity that we've been doing, which has to some degree surprised me, given the years of Brexit uncertainty and then locking down with COVID and so on and so forth. So I suppose I would say the biggest highlight of the year for me has been that actually we are doing some good business at the moment, and certainly this year and last year actually better than through those uncertainty years of Brexit. So I'm very optimistic about the future and the way it's going, and in particular with the continued low interest rates, which I think are always going to be low for the foreseeable future, despite an element of inflation, which I have got to say has always and traditionally been very good for the classic car market. I think you'll bear me out on that one, Jamie. So, yeah, that's the highlight of the year, the level of business.
How about you, JB? I mean, you're still involved in the auction business as well as advising clients. We've all been able to go to some auctions this year, haven't we? And of course, there's been a lot of online ones as well.
Yeah, that's right, Steve. And I think there's certainly, I think, a sort of a psychological sort of shift. The last time what we're experiencing now is a yearning, if you like, from the community to enjoy themselves. Living through lockdown of COVID, now seeing the light at the end of the tunnel with COVID, I think there's a release of sort of energy, anticipation, and the last time I felt that was a fairly traumatic event, which was 9/11 all those years ago, and there were a lot of people sort of saying, you just don't know what's around the corner, and we have got some savings, we've thought about getting a car, we're now going to get that car. And I think that's been a good stimulus in a way for people to want to get on and do things if they've got the means to do so.
And how about you, Charles? Because your business is based on people buying cars and asking you to, with your system, to curate and sort all the paperwork and everything out for them. Are you seeing more people doing that now?
I think certainly the interest in online content around cars boomed during lockdown. Certainly myself, and I'm sure some of you, when you're stuck at home and you can't go out and go to Silverstone or Goodwood or wherever it might be, the place to turn is obviously the internet. So I think there was a massive spike in people listening to podcasts, automotive podcasts, reading content, great content online. And but I have to say, since we've kind of come out the other side of lockdowns, I'm quite relieved now that we can go to events again. And certainly it feels like that pent-up excitement about events opening again has really been released. So, look at the Revival, Hampton Court, some of the concourses, some of the racing that's been taking place, great full grids, and some amazing cars have come out of the woodwork after this sort of quite quiet period. So I'm very glad to see that it feels like the events are back up and running again. And of course, people are still very active online, looking at content. And for us, we are a management tool for car owners. So where you can upload your car and look after all the admin associated with it. So we had a real boost during the lockdown period, people coming and using our platform. But again, I'm very glad that we're all back at events now.
Well, that's good. Neal, perhaps I can ask you something. The more modern Astons have been very, very popular, and it's been a bit of I don't know what the split is in the company between Gaydon era cars and the Newport Pagnell cars, but are you finding people are interested in the very latest, sort of like second generation Gaydon cars now, or do they still prefer the original V8 Vantage and DB9s?
No, well, just to support something that Nick mentioned earlier, remembering back on the year, the first 3.5 months of the year, we weren't able to have any visitors to the showroom, and everything was being done online, phone calls, emails, videos, WhatsApp calls, which made for a very tough start to the year. The inquiry levels were outstanding, really, but the conversion of those without the ability to actually come in and see the car and drive the car was more challenging. And we were talking ourselves into it. We said, when we do reopen, we're going to go gangbusters, aren't we? And actually, we're pleased to say that did happen. But what kept us really busy during that first quarter is the more modern cars. When it comes to buying a 50, 60-year-old car, naturally, people generally want to come in and see it and smell it and drive it and touch it. But the nearly new cars, and in particular the last of the line first generation Gaydon cars, were incredibly popular for the first 6 months and still remain popular, but incredibly popular for the first 6 months of the year. V12 Vantages, DBS, second generation Vanquishes, those were the most in demand, and people were comfortable transacting online, not needing to come and see the cars first. They might ask for a bit more information on a car's service history and some more detailed photography of the front of the car or the driver's bolster, but generally they would be comfortable saying, yes, I'd like that, could you send that in the transporter, and complete the business that way.
Which sort of reflects the way that some of the online auctions have been working this year, that they've predominantly sold more modern cars, Porsches and Ferraris, for example, limited edition Porsche GT3s and things like that, where you sort of know where you are with it. You don't necessarily have to, which is good and bad, I guess, because if you've got an Aston DB, you want to experience it and enjoy the buying and driving experience from physical premises.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And quite often, people buying the later cars from us may have had one before. They might have had an earlier DB9 and are now looking at a DB9 GT. So they've got a broad idea of what to expect, and therefore don't feel it necessary to come in and drive it first. In our experience, people buying a classic Aston Martin for the first time, they need a lot more support during the purchase process. They need some education and navigating through the different models and the different variants, but they also want to come in and be taught in some cases how to drive and how to enjoy the car as well, and that's not available buying a car on an online auction. It has been our experience, yeah.
But I'm looking around here, there's some fantastic cars here, but I don't see a DB11. Is that whereas when they were making the DB9s and DBSs, you were selling those, weren't you? DBS Volantis and things like that.
Typically, we start to get involved with the sale of a model when it gets to 4 or 5 years old. Once the car's past its initial warranty period, the main dealer network naturally start to concentrate their efforts on the next model coming along. They generally concentrate on brand new and nearly new cars, but 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, that's when a model starts to be sold by others than the main dealer network. The DB11 came along, the first of the second century Aston Martins, as they're known in the trade, came along in 2017, so 4 years old. So I would imagine in years to come we'll be more actively involved in the second century cars. But up to now, we've sold one DBS Superleggera Volante, but we haven't been as involved yet in the second century cars.
Interesting. Yes, I mean, we touched on auctions, and perhaps it's appropriate to ask Jamie. It's very easy to look at the results of auctions and draw all sorts of conclusions from what's happening to the market. I mean, if I can ask you, Jamie, do you think that's reasonable, or do cars go to auction and are bought at auction for particular reasons? It's easy, presumably you get the money straight away and you sell it and that's it, or you buy it straight away.
Yeah, no, crikey. Over the 30 plus years I was doing it, sometimes the auction house is the first port of call, sometimes the last resort, and anywhere on the spectrum in between. And I think, why do people want to consign a car to an auction? Well, sometimes they just want to leave it to somebody else to get on and do it. There's no part exchange involved. If you get your car sold, you can expect your net proceeds 21 days from date of sale. So there's a certain sort of cleanliness to it. And we can be the firewall between all the interested parties and the client who's our seller. But I think when one looks at the prices achieved, cars tend to make whatever price they make for a reason, and the various sort of price guides out there, I think, have got better. I remember in Classic and Sports Car magazine years and years ago there was a price guide that said, you know, in A condition, B condition, and you just couldn't use it as a good gauge. Whereas I think things like Glenmarch is quite a good source of research because it will actually link you to the catalogue description for you to then get a handle on, well, why did that car make so much, or indeed why did it make so little? And I think as cars become ever more valuable, cars have to be ever more right to make the right price, and matching numbers, originality, all those sort of elements take on an even more critical aspect the higher up the value level you go.
I mean, what do you think, Nick? I mean, you must get people have asked you, should I buy at auction, or should I buy from here?
But first, to go back to the price reference point, you're quite right. There is always a reason why a car sells at a certain price, but unfortunately, that's not always clear in the various different publications, be they online or magazines, that will publish auction results. You would simply get that car, whatever year it was, makes X amount, and people do use that information as a guide. They use it against people like ourselves in any form of negotiation. Why are you asking so much for that car? This one sold for that. And so there is a missing link in terms of, you know, how these things are explained, and I think it makes life difficult, in particular today when you know, we've just talked about how so much of sales in the last 24 months have been conducted via emails and remotely, and the culture in general society is very much sort of gocompare.com. You know, you want your insurance, you just go and find the cheapest on Go Compare. the bulk of the email inquiries that we receive on motor cars are 2 lines, and they're either the first or second is, what's the price? If we don't publish it, sometimes we won't publish the price because we want to get some engagement. And it's rather dispiriting, actually, because you want to be able to explain why something is the price. And as most of our clients know, the cars that we're selling are of a particular quality, which, of course, never comes cheaply. So, yeah, it's always a difficult thing, this publication of auction results. And, of course, you know, particularly more recently, there's been a number in the Aston Martin world of cars that have been going through auctions which have been no reserve, and that completely distorts things, because at the end of the day, there's a reason it's no reserve, and it's probably because it's a quality issue, it's probably because it's a matching numbers issue, or a colour issue, or a tax issue, that all sorts of different reasons we know about. It's not explained, and I think it makes life quite difficult from a dealer's perspective, not least of which because at the end of the day, there's a trust issue that has to be got over in the first place. Why is this dealer wanting to charge me so much money for something? So it's quite annoying in a way, but understandable. And of course, people that publish the information are just doing their job, and as are auctioneers and auction companies. It's always a challenge, and it's been a challenge as long as I can remember in 40 plus years of being in the business. So it is what it is.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, you mentioned Brexit before. We discussed this at a bit of length last time. Now that we've had a full year of it, with all the implications, and of course we've had COVID confusing things as well, has that affected your business very much? I think this country we made the cars, and they made a lot of right-hand drive cars, so a lot of them are going to be traded over here, aren't they?
Yes, it's you can't deny it's affected the business, simply because if we want to go and buy a car in Europe and bring it back here, we've got to pay VAT. And likewise, if someone from Germany, France, Italy, whatever, wants to buy a car that's been registered in the UK and take it home, they've got to pay VAT at the local rates. And yes, for some historic cars, it can be at a lower rate, but in the later cars, we are talking 20% or whatever the local tax rate is. So until the effects of that have sort of worked through the market and the price is adjusted accordingly, that has had an effect. And if you wanted to quantify that in any way, you could, if we look back on our business over the last few years, I would say certainly in the early teens, 20, maybe even more than 20% of our sales business was conducted with people in overseas markets, not always Europe, but overseas markets. So some of that has been taken away by the Brexit issue, and it's not purely the financial aspect anymore. It's actually just the thought process for any of our German clients or European clients are now immediately thinking to themselves, I can't buy a car in England because I've got to pay tax. So they're not even looking, which is, I'm not going to get into the whole Brexit issue, but it is a great shame, and it hasn't really been thought, well, maybe it was thought through properly, I don't know. But it has affected the level of trade with
But
Europe.
are you seeing, Jamie, of clients that you might have someone in continental Europe that would prefer to buy a car in France or Germany because they know where they are with the tax on it?
Yeah, and I think it's more acute for those cars less than 30 years old, where you're dealing with the full VAT.
20%.
Or 5,000 miles.
Yes.
Well, there's that as well.
Yeah.
And I sat in on a couple of calls where Bonhams as a company were having clinics with the staff about, well, the pros and cons, the fors and against, when talking to someone in Germany who's thinking about selling something in the UK, or someone in Germany thinking about buying a lot in the UK. And yeah, with antiques, it's a bit similar to the older cars, a reduced import tariff within the member states and the UK. And with fine art at Bonhams, of course, they operate a much higher buyer's premium. And within the EU, or pre-Brexit, if a German bought a painting for £100,000, there could be something like £25,000 worth of buyer's premium, which in itself was subject to VAT. So 20% on 25,000, that's £5,000. Well, now that German doesn't have to pay the VAT on the buyer's premium. So on the one hand, they save the £5,000 off the VAT on the BP, but they will still have to pay 5-8% or whatever it is, importing a £125,000 painting into the UK, into Germany rather. So we have been looking into it big time to try and reassure potential sellers or potential buyers that it isn't just the hit that you think it is. And Neal and Nick can talk more about paying VAT on profit margins. If you sell a car to a German, then you are not you're saving the VAT element on the margin.
On the margin, that's
providing you're getting a healthy enough margin. There's maybe a little bit of wiggle room there, but the net result is, personally, for any number of reasons, I'd rather Brexit didn't happen, but we are where we are, and I think the only thing we can kind of hope down the road is free movement of a sort of a single market, if you like, but that's a long way off, and we're going to have to learn to conduct commerce as we are at the moment.
How about transporting cars? Was this something else that came up? That if you wanted to do an event, Le Mans Classic, or you wanted to go to a driving tour or something like that?
Well,
I mean, perhaps Charles, do you know?
Yeah.
Well, I race a number of different.
You race your Cobra, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I race a number of different cars, and certainly I've done Le Mans Classic, I've done Nürburgring, a lot of these different European events before, and for me certainly it was the uncertainty. Do we need some sort of pass? What is the logistics of taking a car to Le Mans Classic or wherever it is, Spa, to do the 6 hours? It was just the uncertainty of not knowing what the process was. And I don't think the government, and there wasn't that much information about how to do it. And certainly I didn't feel comfortable. And in the end, last year I didn't do any racing. This year I've kept to the UK, partly because I didn't want to get into the bureaucracy involved with taking a car out to the continent. So I think definitely impacted. Hopefully, I think people are coming to terms and working out how to do it in an efficient manner and all the different bits of paperwork that you need to do. But I haven't taken a car out to race yet into Europe, and I guess partly because of the logistics.
I believe at Goodwood I was talking to a big Aston collector, and he was asked to bring some cars in from Europe, and it was the money in the bonds and the whole thing. It was, and okay, you get the bond back or whatever it is, but there was all sorts of arrangement fees, which that is gone, and it was a lot of money.
It's increased paperwork, increased bureaucracy, and increased costs.
And decreased participation.
Well, yeah.
Because,
I mean, finally on that, do you think that it will be in a situation where left-hand drive Astons are traded outside the UK more because they're more likely to be?
I think certainly the more modern
certain
cars,
models,
it's going to be very difficult to sell a 6, 7, 8-year-old Aston Martin left-hand drive effectively from the UK, because that car's going to attract 20%, as much as 29% VAT if it's going into the Netherlands. That's going to make us very uncompetitive unless our prices reflect that. But I think just to round up on this particular section, it gives us reason for optimism for 2022, that the level of business that we've been able to do in 2021 has been without much international trade. Whereas it typically represents about 20% of our sales, as Nick said, this year we're likely to be under 10% of our sales export. And that's that is as people get used to the new rules around Brexit, but also we have to face there's been very little international visitors to the UK this year because of travel restrictions. Next year, hopefully, we will get through the winter unscathed, and we are facing a more normal year next year. I think we're going to see a big return of international visitors who haven't been for the last couple of years and are missing desperately the Goodwood Revival and the Concours of Elegance and everything else that they used to enjoy coming over to visit. So it could be a bumper year 2022 if that European and international trade comes back and things remain fairly consistent from a domestic trade point of view.
Just the other point I might make on that is that I don't think it's just the European market and the UK market that's separated a little bit, but also the US market. If you look at the results at Monterey, the auctions there, and the buoyancy of the market in the US, and again, Jamie will probably give much more guidance on this than I can, but it feels like the US market and the UK market have become quite detached. And stuff is going unbelievably well at some points in the US, whereas in the UK it's a bit quieter at different points, and it feels like that detachment. It's not just between continental Europe and the UK, but also the US.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And there were a couple of very strong Aston Martin results in the sales at Monterey this year that we were all looking at. Wow.
But I think that this tells you the story, which is if you take away the ability to move things cross-border, in other words, you compartmentalise different markets, you'll have different market conditions in those markets, and it won't transfer across in the same way that it did. We had a more international market pre-Brexit than we have now. Now we have a UK market and the occasional overseas sale. You can't really plan on overseas
No, that's right.
sales.
I think back in the 1980s.
Yeah. Because it's not, 20, 30 years ago, you'll remember as well as I do, an epicenter of the classic car trade was the UK. There weren't so many businesses operating in this sphere in Europe and in the United States. They've grown up and they now have developed their own markets, and we've just shut our borders to it.
Yeah, no, indeed. And I think it's a bit like British Airways, sort of one world. And I think over the past sort of 10, 15 years, pricing was pretty consistent around the continents. And I remember back in the 1980s where, more often than not, prices in America seemed to be higher than prices in Europe. And that's just the way it used to be. And the worldwide sort of trade and commerce, it leveled everything out. And you're right, there's that sort of polarization where people are mainly dealing with within their borders.
Local market.
Yeah, local markets.
Okay, let's have a quick thoughts round the table on where Aston is at the moment. Perhaps starting with you, Neal. They've got DBX, they're talking electric, they're talking hybrid, we've got mid-engine, and of course we've got Formula One. It's all changed from the old gentleman's club era. How's that affecting your business? What do you think of them?
Well, it doesn't affect our day-to-day business to a huge degree, although people buying cars from Aston Martin's past do want the reassurance that the company's going to exist in the future and it's moving forwards. So it's definitely part of what we do. But I would imagine it's very exciting times up at Gaydon at the moment. There's a hell of a lot going on. I imagine they're burning the midnight oil just about every night. Lots of work on the models that are going to be coming in the next few years. They've got the Valkyrie just about to come to market and be delivered to customers. And there are other mid-engine cars that are going to follow that, the Valhalla and potentially a Vanquish down the line. The DBX, which is now getting on for a couple of years old. Be interesting to see what the sales numbers look like on that. I've only seen what's published in the financial news, but I would imagine they've had a good run of success so far with the DBX amongst the Aston Martin enthusiast community. People that have got a number of other Astons have probably said, oh yeah, I'll have one of those. Can they sustain the interest in DBX longer term once they've gone through that hardcore Aston Martin owner list? that's going to be more challenging for them. That's when they're going to have to continue to revamp the product, a hybrid, a sportier version, a longer wheelbase version. That's going to sustain the interest for the next few years. But no, I can imagine it's very exciting times up there. There's a lot going on. The company's in a lot more secure position than it was 4 or 5 years ago. So I think as Aston Martin enthusiasts, we can look to the future with a lot more optimism than we have been able to in the past.
And I think Formula One is definitely making a difference with the global exposure, particularly in North America. I mean, Charles, what do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with Neal. You know, a lot going on there. I think having the Formula One team, is a big step forward. And it's great to see the brand up there on the world stage, and it's starting to do very well, which is good. DBX, I personally think, should have been a bit earlier, and I think they slightly missed the timing with the DBX. I think it is a good product, and I think people are, when you compare it to the Bentley Bentayga and some of the other cars in the market at the moment, I think it does stack up. It's an exciting product, and I personally think it will do well. And obviously, it's been doing well these last couple of years, and I hope it does. And I'd love to get behind the wheel of one and see what it compares to. I've driven the Bentayga, I've driven the Range Rover, and I'm looking forward to getting behind the wheel of one at some point.
How about you, Jamie? Electric Aston for you? You're a man with a bit of a passion for electric cars, and you're confident in their range.
I shall resist looking at the camera. This is an in-house joke. I've tipped up today in my 1-week-old ID3, and with any amounts of range anxiety, travelling 100 miles. But no, I think Aston, one thing to me they continually seem to do is produce really good looking cars, and that's being maintained. The performance and the reviews of them are fundamentally very good, and of course I suppose when you're thinking about when are we going to be creating the next model, by the time you've gone through that thought process to it rolling off the production line, you are 2 or 3 years hence, and the world economic situation could be all over the place. And I think when a lot of the luxury car brands were looking where's the next big market, there was a lot of focus into China, and who had a voracious appetite towards modern high performance and luxury motor cars. That's probably subsided a bit in the last year or two. So it must be an ongoing battle to be innovative and create something new that is going to set your brand apart from all the other competition, because there's a hell of a lot of competition out there at this level. And Neal did touch on a very valid point. The strength of the Aston brand is immense, and I'm glad that they are looking forward with technology and what have you, rather than perhaps looking back a little bit with the continuation cars that they were doing, and becoming that much more grown up and serious, I think, as a company.
Nick, anything to add on that?
There's sort of no doubt there is a defining moment going on at the moment, generally, and in particular for Aston Martin. The Formula One thing is undoubtedly good for them from the point of view of getting the brand known around the world. You can't, Formula One itself is also on a big rise at the moment after the Netflix stuff that's going on. And Aston have obviously got to look at the future and got to comply with the various regulations and what has to happen in the future. So it's a big shift that's going on at the moment in Aston Martin, as is the whole industry. From our point of view, I actually think that it's good for us. And it's good for us because, as you've said, the old cars are the brand, and it's the halo that is moving the DBXs of this world and what will come after DBX, whether it's hybrid or electric and everything else. If you took DBX purely on merit without its heritage, it might struggle. if only because it's not cutting edge technology yet, and I'm sure it'll get there because they're on catch up, we know. So yes, it's a big defining moment over the next few years for Aston. But the fact that it is happening and those cars are going to be sold in the China and Russia and India and all the big markets out there other than the UK and Europe can only do good for the old cars as well. It's a sort of win-win situation, if that makes sense. So yeah, the future looks bright, and yes, I believe that the company is on a much sounder footing than it was a very few years ago, and we're looking forward to the future simply because actually there is a whole new era of car coming through, but we know there's a big appetite for the old era car as well, which will give an owner something to get up early on a Sunday morning to go and have a drive in. It's an excitement, it's an adventure, it's something that no new era product of automated driving, which is the way it's all going, and electric is probably, I don't believe anyway, is going to give those buyers of an Aston Martin. They're buying them for a different reason. The people that are buying those are buying them though because of the heritage of the brand. So yeah, win-win.
Very good. Now, going back in time a little bit, one of the hot areas of collecting in recent years has been the sort of cars from the 80s and 90s, some young timer German special saloons, some rally homologation specials, and right at the top of the market, Ferraris such as the F40. I think we've seen some record figures for F40s recently in the auctions and private sales. Now, where does Aston sit with that? I mean, we're talking Aston's a V8 Zagato really, and supercharged cars, aren't we?
It's quite difficult. It's interesting. It's all about legacy, isn't it? So if you take the 90s, which is perhaps the more difficult period, you were looking at, I don't know, was 550 Maranellos out there?
Well, I'm more thinking of the special runs like the Bugatti EV110 and.
Well, it's just difficult because at that particular time, in the 80s, it was the V8. The V8 was a great car in a general sense. In other words, it was a car that was designed and built to be driven and used, and people bought it, instead of a Bentley or a big Merc or a Jaguar even. And so, by definition, it wasn't an overt sports car. And likewise, in the 90s, certainly the Virage, not an overt sports car, just a good car that did its job in a touring sense. But of course today, people buying a 90s car or an 80s car probably want something that's had overt performance, a mid-engine, manual, and very few Astons actually fill that criteria. They're a good car in a general sense that you can put 4 people in it and fill the boot with luggage and go off for a nice weekend somewhere, but they're not as you might think, a Countach or a Testarossa or a Boxer or a turbo 3.3 turbo Porsche. It's just not that kind of car. And so there's a slight vacuum there, and it's a different buyer. Fortunately, that's also married up to actually very small production numbers. So whilst there is that market and it is happening in these cars, it's not quite such a rush, got to have it market as the cars that I've just mentioned, Boxers and Porsches and so on and so forth.
In a sense, in the 80s, Aston was sort of fighting with one arm behind their back in a sense, where they weren't a large motor manufacturer, and therefore profits, income was always tight. And I think Aston had to be a different type of creative in the 80s, and of course, to me, I love the V8 Zagato.
The irony, going back to the Zagato, I was going to come back to that, is whilst it's an exciting car, and yes, there's only 50 of them, that is its Achilles heel. Because there is only 50 of them, there's very little awareness of them, and that makes it quite a difficult car to sell, funnily enough, because people don't know what it is.
No, and today a stock, if you can call it that, a stock V8 Vantage compared to a V8 Vantage Zagato it doesn't make sense that the values are so closely aligned.
But I can remember, and you'll remember selling them, that when the V8 Gt came out, they were bought by all the really big players, weren't they? Everybody who was an Aston collector, or anybody who wanted the most expensive car, the fastest car you could get, bought a V8 Gt. Well, lots of them converted to big engines. That was one colossal car. I mean, Rowan Atkinson is one, for example.
It was always Aston's answer on a very limited budget to the 288 GTO and the 959 Porsche. And it may sound silly saying that, but at the end of the day, that was the comparison car in the day. Yes, it didn't have electronics. Yes, it didn't have four-wheel drive. Yes, it didn't have this, but it did have raw power.
Well, the Ferraris didn't have all that clever electronic stuff. The 288 GTO and F40 were just extremely powerful.
Yeah. So it had all of that, but everyone, I mean, how many 288 GTOs are there? How many 959s? I'm not sure what the number is. I can tell you, it's an awful lot more than 50.
Absolutely,
and that's the problem.
Yeah.
Is the biggest problem. Is that.
So it could be a bit of a buy then, couldn't it? We're going to come back to that at the end. So perhaps we'll leave that one there. But
it's been said before.
But worth getting Charles's view on 1990s Astons. You were looking lustfully at our supercharged Vantage outside earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've done quite a lot of mileage in a V8 Volante long wheelbase, so a 2000 car, one of the last of that era. And indeed, actually, back at Salon Privé, I managed to reunite the long wheelbase car, which is in my family, with a short wheelbase, which is super rare. I think it's one of 8 of the V550 Volante short wheelbases. Yeah. And I went in that car, and God, they could not be more different. You know, the long wheelbase is, a cruising car. It's pretty leisurely. It's certainly not a sports car. But you get in the V550 and the twin superchargers. It's a really exciting place to be. And I don't think I've experienced just that brute analog power in a convertible ever. And the manual gearbox, it's really old school charm, and I loved it. And I kind of came out of that car thinking, wow, I need a V550. Which obviously the Volantes are incredibly rare and very valuable, but the coupes I think are, in my opinion, very good value.
So given the choice, pound for pound, would you have a 1980s V8 Vantage or a 1990s supercharged Vantage?
That's an unfair question because I want both, but my father's had his V8 Vantage from '83 since new, which he's still got, and sports days and all these different things. I was in that car, so that's a slightly unfair question. But I would love a V550, or if I could afford it, a V600. Again, haven't got in one of those, but I think they're. And also, I think they've aged really nicely. The round headlights at the back. You talked about the 288 GTO. That's a very kind of iconic round design at the back of the car. I think they've aged really well. And certainly, when I took the long wheelbase Volante to Salon Privé, wherever a month or so, or 2 months, a couple of months ago, when you parked it in the Aston Martin Owners Club car park, and you have all the modern Astons there, those two cars stood out like nothing else. It was staggering, and there's not a huge amount of design has been kind of carried forward into the new generation Aston. And I think they look good. They kind of held their sort of their spot there, and I think they've, from a price wise, I think they're good value at the moment.
They're a poster car for a generation that's going to be buying cars more actively from here on in.
And just one other point about that is that you talked about the electronics. When they came out, my impression, they weren't a hugely technologically advanced car at the time, which they might have got criticised on. But now, if you want it as a collectible car or a classic car, you don't really care. You want something which is fun to drive, engaging, gives you that tingle and excitement. And whether or not it was modern for the era when it came out is kind of irrelevant. You just want that experience. So I think they've aged quite well, and get one on a wet road, and I'm sure it'll give you plenty of adrenaline.
Less electronics, less to go wrong.
Yeah, and more fun.
You mentioned Salon Privé, which obviously was one of the meetings we had this year when everybody was mixing, and we were sort of getting back to normal again. What was your favourite event of this year? Because they've all been getting back in the groove again, haven't they?
Yeah, I think on the concourse side, I have to say Hampton Court, and I went to both Salon Privé and Hampton Court, just because I think the setting is staggering, and also it was a much more relaxed vibe, and the quality of cars there I thought was absolutely superb, and the variety. And again, there wasn't the sort of fenced off areas like there was a little bit in Salon Privé. Hampton Court, you could just amble around, and you had incredible Bugattis, Astons, 917s. You had, of course, the Bulldog, which is, again, I absolutely delight to see it there. And also particularly the fact that it's now been restored back to its original specification. So, for instance, the interior is back to its brown. And I know that previously it had been incorrectly restored to tan. It's been taken back to brown. And I think the restoration that CMC have done on that car is really special. So seeing it in the flesh, I've been tracking its progress over the last year or two, the restoration, and seeing it there with obviously the gull wing doors and the 5 lights in the front was pretty exciting. So I think Hampton Court for me was the highlight of concourse. And again, it's a bit cliche, but the Goodwood Revival, we hadn't really had it last year. I think it came back with a bang. I was very lucky to be driving in the Stirling Moss tribute in an Austin Healey. And so I was lucky to be on track with a number of great Astons, DBR1s, DB3Ss, and all sorts. And although we weren't wearing helmets, and we probably got in a bit of trouble for doing it, we were going pretty quickly down the back straight. And also having obviously Susie Moss there, Elliot Moss, and the Duke of Richmond did an incredible job of a tribute to Sterling and his great legacy, obviously with the Mercedes SLR amongst the crowd. So a really special moment, and I think I'm very glad that the Revival hasn't lost its charm. Every year it comes back and it's something fresh and exciting, and I think this year
we're very lucky in this country that we do have these superlative events. I believe, I wasn't there, but Pebble Beach was very successful this year as well, and Hampton Court certainly raised its game. Jamie, you went along to that?
Yeah, I went to the Hampton Court concours, and there were some great cars, and it was good to see Simon with the TZ2, which, crikey, when was the last time a TZ2 was in the UK? Many years ago, and I also saw, was it a DB4? Was it a two-tone DB4?
Yeah,
incredible.
And I was rather taken. Not sure I'd be brave enough to want to own a two-tone DB4, but I looked at it and I thought, yeah, it works. It does work.
And the DB3S Coupe was there as well, which is a lovely car.
Just a broader point on events, and I'm not sure if everyone agrees, but I personally feel this year, interest in classic cars and events has never been stronger.
You've had some fantastic events here, haven't you?
Incredible.
I was going to say,
on a local level.
Absolutely. And it is on a local level that's really important. We talk about the Goodwoods, and the Revival is a remarkable event. I'm sure we've all been there and enjoyed it. Although, from a purely spectator's point, from a personal point of view, I thought the members' meeting was better in a funny sort of way, just because it's less frenetic. But the number of local meetings, I know you're a fan of the Harpenden Classics on the Common, and Matt here organised a little event locally as well with cars on the farm. These events are springing up all over the place, and the events we do. To be honest, I won't say it's staggering, but I do get sort of a little surprised with just the ones that we do here, the numbers of people that turn up. I understand why. It's flattering, but
Well, having a few of the big events in the diary is great, but just to be able to access something on a Sunday morning that doesn't need too much forethought, and that you could take your little son along to or daughter along to, and not feel you're putting anyone out by doing so, an excuse to start up their car and go for a burn and have a coffee and have a bacon roll. That's enough for a lot of people, and it's those events that have really been so popular. And I personally think by social media, events, merchandise, I think we can say that classic cars have never been as popular.
Sure, but I think we go back to COVID, don't we? Where for, let's say, give or take 18 months or so, what's that old phrase? You don't know what you're missing unless it's taken away from you. And maybe we got blasé, complacent, anaesthetised to the fact that we're off here, we're off there, and we regarded it as a sort of a natural sort of right to go to these places, and maybe didn't fully appreciate the events because we were rolling from one to the other. Sort of detox from that for 18 months. There's a pent-up energy and desire and demand to actually want to go to these events, and I think it's re-stimulated us as an industry and as a hobby into the world of old cars again.
Yeah, I think that there's a big future in it as well, and don't underestimate the social media thing. I've often mentioned it in the summer. I was up in the Cotswolds and found myself V12 Vantage coming this way, V12 Vantage coming that way, one coming up behind me. What are all these cars doing here? Next
They're
day,
trying to flag you down, Nick. They wanted you to sell them.
No, I was, it was Sunday, and but the next day, go onto Instagram and oh yeah, here's all those cars. Oh, they're all pictured at the Cotswold Farm shop, and there's a community that have sprung up purely on social media, and they've managed to get 35 odd cars together for a day out, which is great, and that's something which I don't know how the car clubs are going to deal with it unless they jump on the social media bandwagon, but that's the way it's all going. And I can completely understand it. You've got a nice car, it's all very well and sticking it in the garage and polishing it, but you've got to have something to do with it. And so all these little events, whether it's showing it on the Common or meeting at the Cotswold Farm shop or going to Bewley or going to Goodwood, is really what it's all about.
We hosted the Aston Day group that formed on social media, Twitter and Instagram, and they've been going to different dealers or venues one Sunday a month throughout the year. It was our turn to host in October. We had a car park full of Aston Martins of different eras. Great group, enthusiastic, knowledgeable, and that's all come together via social media.
Via social media, yeah.
Well, I suppose you have the day out, don't you? And then you enjoy it for the next few weeks on social media or on
I think
Instagram and Facebook.
It's a little bit more than just that, and that for me it's all about exposure. So, as an example, a lot of my friends have knew nothing about the classic car world, and I take them to an event. As soon as they go to one, they're like, wow, this is an incredible community of people, amazing cars. You hear these cars going and experience them, smell them. It's a great experience. And the great thing about social media, be it Instagram or Facebook, wherever it might be, is people that wouldn't traditionally have access to, what's it like to be in a DB5 Aston, or what's it like to be in any sort of Porsche 911, wherever it might be, can suddenly get a glimpse of what it's all about. And through some of these influencers, which I think I'm naturally a little bit skeptical of, you can get a sense for the ownership experience without owning one or even being near one. I think what that does, it sows the seed of interest. And that's why I'm a big fan of some of these, Instagram and for automotive content. And then 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line, they suddenly think, okay, I've got some money, I've made some money. And I remember watching that video of, a V8 Vantage, wherever it might be, 20 years ago on Instagram, and they've sowed the seed to then want that car in the future. And for me, it's all about exposure, because we all know, all of us being very privileged, that when you drive these cars and you experience them, they're fantastic fun. But it's just people that haven't had that initial experience to instill that passion. It's a way of accessing them at zero cost. And I think it's important.
So we're saying Instagram and social media is the new poster.
Yes, absolutely.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
So people are buying things. They're getting back into the world of activity and events, and also I think people are, with the economic background of buying into tangible assets. There's been some watch auctions this week where the prices have just been absolutely stratospheric, extraordinarily high prices. Which sort of begs the question, what is an investor grade car, and how did you find, why do people want to collect things, and what would you say was a quintessentially investor grade car if someone wanted to look at it from that point of view, Neal?
Yeah, it does differ depending on the era of car. A more modern car is going to have a different set of criteria to the investor-led buyer than a 1960s car may have. But generally what people are looking for, lower mileage from an investment point of view, collector point of view, is typically requested of us. Known histories, clear histories, condition of the car, of course, even more so the more modern cars. The fascination on condition sometimes takes us by surprise a little bit, knowing that they're going to go out and drive them potentially. In the older cars, it's not necessarily only about its cosmetic appearance, it's about its mechanical condition as well. The history files, crucially important to the investor type buyer. Provenance, who's owned it, where it's been, is there a clear record of that? Those are generally the things that the questions that are asked of us about a car when people are considering something for investment.
I mean, Jamie, you've sold some incredible machinery over the years, not just Aston's, just talking generally. Think of a car that really sort of meets that, when it was some extraordinary machine that just ticks all the boxes and went for a fortune.
Ugh, crikey. Off the top of your head, it's quite difficult, and it's one of those questions. What car should I buy as a real investment? And you think to yourself, oh, do you have to? Can't you just buy what you want? Any number of times over the years, I think we've probably all had it. What car should I buy? It's not up to me. It's up to you what sort of car you want to buy. And rather pithily, a number of years ago, I absolutely never would have wanted to have owned a Jensen Interceptor. I couldn't understand why people did want to collect them. I don't know, I look at them now and I think to myself, actually, that's not a bad looking car. And you can kind of get led by what the market is trying to tell you, rather than what you're actually sort of thinking yourself. And an investor grade car, well, the latest Gordon Murray car that's coming out. What is it, sort of 3 million quid or whatever it is, plus tax. Well, yeah, if you've got it, that's probably an investor grade car. And it will probably end up going like the McLaren F1 did. It's a hell of a lot of money today, but it's probably going to be worth that much more.
Well,
10, 15
the McLaren F1 was a hell of a lot of money in its day.
£600,000, wasn't it?
Yeah, massive.
And
at that time, I knew Aston was 120, 130.
Probably one bullet point that I missed was rarity, of course. That's going to affect.
I think different people have different criteria for what is a collector or an investor grade car. I think the bigger question, where you started, Steve, was what makes people collect? And I think that's quite an interesting subject in itself that we're never going to be able to answer, because we're not psychologists, but they do. And I don't think that's ever going to change, which is good to know. But collector cars, as in watches, and it's the same with, dare I say, handbags and paintings. I mean, there's lots of things that people collect, and they're generally an appreciation of, craft and quality and small numbers, and something that people in the main don't have. It's special and unique to them, maybe, and brings memories back or whatever. There are lots of different reasons, but I think the usual things apply. Though it's just all the items you've mentioned, and I think increasingly, as time passes, it's going to be about history, because and we've had this conversation in the past. Condition is something that you can always buy. Actually, you could just pay to turn a nasty car into a nice car, or a scruffy watch into a, you can restore. But you can't always buy a historic car, something that's got genuine history. A Bentley blower that's got the outer lap record at Brooklands, or anything that's got a special and significant hook, and it's demonstrably that, is definitely investor grade.
Well, I'm thinking of a couple of things that you've been involved with: the Obscena car at Monaco, and also the John Surtees BMW went for a lot, didn't it? 507.
Yes, no, I think that's a good case in point. And of course, with an auction scenario, with the Surtees car, it was a BMW 507 in itself, a very collectible motor car. This was a car that was bought new by John Surtees, not once owned by John Surtees. It was bought new by John Surtees, and the backstory as to how he acquired the car, I think it was by winning the World Championship. Was it on an MV Augusta? And I think Count Augusta basically said, John, great result. Go out there and treat yourself to a car, and I'll contribute towards it. Probably as a result of John Surtees turning around saying, "Oh, I identified a 507 and not a Fiat 500." And so it wasn't just a case that Surtees owned the car. It was the whole story behind how he came into owning the car. And then, of course, sadly, John died, and it was being sold by the family. And a number of years ago, Christie's sold a collection of motor cars owned by Elton John. And the prices achieved, one of which was a V8, I think, in the sale that did very, very well. And
Still comes in for its servicing every year.
Fantastic. And
One I supplied, Neal.
and Elton John was the seller, and those cars commanded a really high price. One or two of those cars were subsequently sold 2 or 3 years later. The market wasn't necessarily any different, but the prices achieved for those cars were that much lower than first time round because they were cars once owned by Elton John. It wasn't, you weren't the next name in the V5. So the history and the provenance, and of course the originality as well. It's a bit of an old story now, but a number of years ago, to win Pebble Beach, it had to be restored within an inch of its life, with not a hell of a lot of originality left on the car. The preservation class now, which has been going for 10 plus years, is to me becoming a really lovely class. And wouldn't it be nice to see a preservation class car win Pebble Beach one year? And I don't know how many years down the road that is, but I think it's only a matter of time.
I think there's an increasing chance of that, actually, because people that have bought significant cars in the last 20, 30 years have probably been of the mindset to keep on top of it more so than in the 1950s, 1960s, when there wasn't this view to maintaining cars the way that we do now. Now people are meticulous about keeping records for their cars and keeping all their information together. We have to very often disappoint people when they come in to view a 1950s or a 1960s car that we can't show them service and maintenance history back to the day it was built. Why? Because in a lot of cases people didn't keep records. Invoices weren't necessarily produced for works that went on with cars. It would have just been, how much do I owe you? Okay, there you go. So,
Can I pay in cash?
the expectations sometimes are very difficult to manage on older cars. But now, someone that's bought a car in the 90s or noughties, they would have been aware it's important to its future value to keep every invoice, to keep the MOT certificates, keep it in good condition.
And there are computer records.
That's exactly right. Yeah,
which
exactly right.
bits of paper with invoices scribbled.
Yeah,
Get lost.
the ID3 that I collected a week or two back, no real sort of owner's hand,
No, it's all up there.
Yeah, it's all in the cloud. It's all in the cloud. Where's the service voucher book? No, you don't get one.
Yeah.
Really? Okay.
So what do you
Videos,
think,
photographs.
Charles, on why people collect and what drives people to want that last missing piece in their garage or whatever?
Well, certainly with Custodian, before we set it up, we designed the whole technology platform. We spoke to over 100 different people in the industry, including probably 50 collectors. And when the consistent theme in those discussions was the thrill of the hunt. It's trying to find that special car which suits their criteria, or it has a story which, for whatever reason, is aligned with what they want in their collection. And it's almost that the harder to find the right car, the more enjoyable it can be. And again, some of the bits of feedback we had is, I found this car through my neighbour's niece, and whatever it might be. And those are the ones that they really love. They don't necessarily need the easy story, but they need the information. So, for them to be able to know that a car is special and it's worth chasing, and they get that thrill of trying to find the right car for their collection, obviously they need to know the history of the car, and it needs to tell a story. And going back to talking about what makes certain cars special, and talking about the John Surtees car, for me it's all about a car which tells a story. It could be a famous owner, it could be a race car which you might have been crashed, wherever it is. But if it tells a story, then it's got that depth, which I think for me is the interest in a car. And it doesn't, it comes in all sorts of forms. It doesn't have to be, just a concours restored car. It could be any sorts of stories associated with a particular vehicle. And indeed, some of the bad stories, for me, might detract from some people buying the car. It might have had a horrid crash, wherever it might be, but it's part of the tale. It was rebodied by Drogo. A lot of Ferraris, in my opinion, it's a bit of a sad. They started off with a 250 short wheelbase, they had a crash, they went to Drogo, were rebodied, and then 20 years later, 30 years later, they've been restored back to their original specification, which makes sense from a monetary perspective. But for me, it's that evolution. The story is slightly lost. That Drogo body, which is part of its story, is now, put in the back of a barn, or could go onto a new chassis, or wherever it might be. So it's all about stories and the hunt to try and find those stories, which for me, I think is the exciting bit about collecting, as opposed to just buying a car to use.
Interesting. Okay, we're going to finish up with looking ahead and perhaps picking a car that we might be interested in buying or owning. But at the same time, perhaps we'll look at some of the cars that have been sold this year, some interesting cars or favourite cars that you two like or been involved with, and certainly Nick and Neal have sold. So over to you, Neal. And you've got to pick one for next year as well.
We have sold some cracking cars this year, so picking one is difficult. I think I might have to have two. We sold a lovely V12 Vantage Spitfire edition earlier in the year, and I love the model anyway. V12 Vantage is a firm favourite of mine anyway, but these 8 cars that were built by Aston Martin Cambridge, beautiful specification, very dark green, they called it Duxford green over tan, which is a winning combination anyway, but the bespoke features all around the Spitfire theme. I really like that. That's with its new owner. He's very much enjoying it. I spoke to him last week. Not going to sell it in a hurry. Damn. So that was a favourite of mine. And our most recent sale, actually, we've just sold a fantastic DB4, which was a development car for the factory early in its life, the first 5 years of its life, and then owned personally by Tadek Marek. And we've found a great buyer for that car who very much appreciates what he's bought, and he's going to put it on the map, because this car has been under the radar for the last 48 years with its last owner all that time, and he's bought it and he's going to be showing it at some events.
And what do you think people should be looking at next year? Pick an Aston.
I'm back to the 90s again, actually. We've touched on it elsewhere, but I really like the Vantage Le Mans, of which they made 40 at the very end of the production run of V8s, the end of the coach building era for Aston Martin. These represent the absolute culmination of all of those years of hard work. And I think the limited numbers, only 40 of them, the performance, 600 brake horsepower, 2-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, manual gearbox. The price when new, they were over £230,000 20 years ago. I think the future's bright for those cars, a poster car for that generation.
Okay, Charles, what would you?
I have to slightly agree with Neal, to be honest. I think that era is, it's got a lot of capacity to move forward, I think, and they're very exciting. They're old school, they're engaging, they make a lot of noise, brute power, and I think a V550, if your budget stretches to a Le Mans, then even better. But I think there's a lot of car for your money compared to other things at the moment, in my opinion, for that era, and that'd be my choice.
How about you, Jamie? I mean, what have you been involved in this year from a sales point of view? Perhaps Aston-wise that was interesting?
Yeah, well, certainly, I think a car we sold at auction earlier on in the year, that was particularly rewarding because I was up against the preeminent Aston Martin specialist dealers out there who had a handle on this car as well, and it was the Aston Martin Db4 Gt that resided not a million miles away from here, and we had that. Now, what was particularly challenging about that? Get a Db4 GT, fine, price it right, you'll get it sold. But this was a car that, on paper, was technically going to be a difficult car to sell because it was neither fish nor fowl. It was neither beautifully restored or 100% original. and it was the ex-Picking family, David Picking, Db4 Gt, and he was an interesting character, a bit of an engineer himself, and he had done a lot of work on the car, and even sent the body off to body lines and had it painted as well. But it was like an Airfix kit, but with still a lot of work left to do. And that can be a difficult car to find a buyer for because, as I said, it wasn't either totally original or finished. And it was probably a couple of £100,000 away from being finished as well, with the resultant time that would take too. But it was a deceased estate, so we had it priced, I felt, about right. One or two people felt, oh, that sounds a little bit toppy, but we had it in at 1.4 to 1.8 million pounds, and an awful lot of people fancied the idea of owning the car, and we had really some quite competitive bidding on it. And I think by the time the buyer's premium was applied, I think it came into about sort of 2.1, 2.2 million pounds, which on paper was actually a pretty good result for such a car. So I was pleased that we managed to get what could have been a difficult car sold, but sold well.
And what do you fancy putting in your garage on the Aston front? Anything you...
Yeah, well, I look through the lens of Jamie Knight, what does it for me?
Yeah, exactly.
And I've always fancied a Series 2 DB4. Never had one, and I'd like to have one. And I'm going to enjoy the ownership of it, and I'll let the investment look after itself.
Okay, Nick?
There's been a number of highlights of the year. And it would be very easy to say the one that sticks out most was a DB5 Vantage convertible that we sold, part of 3 DB5 Vantages that we took on consignment, and what we call the Vantage Icons collection. So that was the convertible, a fixed head and a shooting brake. So that was very satisfying. Equally as satisfying was seeing the man who bought from us a UB20 DBS, which I found interesting from the point of view that there were, I think it was 6 or 3 of them or whatever in right-hand drive. But the gentleman that bought it is from Germany, and he took it back to Germany. So he's paid the UK price and in full knowledge bought it knowing he's going to have to pay all that VAT again to take it into Germany and its right-hand drive. But he was a fan of Ulrich Betz. So it comes to this thing about the provenance of the car, and that was a very special edition. But more importantly, having listened to what Jamie has just been saying about DB4s, is how I can convince him now to forget about buying that little house that he's talking about buying in Mallorca and the DB4 that I've got outside in its place. A Series 2, incidentally, Jamie.
You can convince me, Nick, but I'm not sure you can convince Emma.
Okay, yeah, got that. But yeah, there's been some great sales this year. But moving forward, I'm a bit like a stuck record, actually. And anyone that knows me well enough will know that I've always been on about 80s V8s, which are, to a degree, having their day today. And they're in a very interesting position in the marketplace if you take their current values and you take the age of the vehicles and the amount of monies that are going to be being spent on them over the next few years in restorations. I think we're going to see within a short number of years quite a turnaround in the value of those cars, because they are going to get, but they are being bought by people who are doing restorations. And we know the cost of a restoration is anyway you look at it, over £200,000. That car, those cars that are being bought for restoration, when they come back to market, which they will one day, they're not going to be at today's prices. And so good V8 now is what I call our tip. But I appreciate, I've been saying that for a few years. So who knows? all our crystal balls are clouded some way, in one way or another.
Am I allowed
Come on then,
am
Steve.
I allowed to
yeah,
say anything?
yeah, what are you having then?
Well, I generally say an early V8 Vantage with a 6.3 engine and upgraded brakes and suspension. Not, with a flip tail and all that sort of stuff bolted on, whatever. I'd also say, given the fact that the prices have got a bit more accessible, I go along with Jamie and the DB4. I like the nice gearbox, nice cars, overdrive, got to have overdrive. That is a very, very nice car. Original interior. That would do me, and I think it would do me now at a more accessible price than it was a few years ago. And you've got a fantastic car that's the equal of many exotic Italian cars for a very good price.
Quicker than some.
Good choice.
I think that just about wraps
Can
it
I,
up.
though, just before you wrap it
Yeah.
up there, Steve,
Yeah.
just take the opportunity, to thank you for coming along for a second year
My
to
pleasure.
do this. We did get, you won't know so much, but Neal and I got an awful lot of feedback from last year's edition of Talking Heads, and the general consensus was that people found it very interesting listening to an informal conversation, and took some positives away from it. So thank you very much for doing that again. Thank you, Jamie, also very much for agreeing to come this year, taking your time, no doubt valuable, and hopefully we'll be able to do it again at some point in the future. And Charles, also likewise, thank you very much. It's been interesting to hear a little bit about Custodian, and that's something I think we're all going to be watching more as time passes, how the online and social media side picks up momentum. So again, thanks very much for coming along.
And do give us some comments. We hopefully we've picked up on some of the comments you made last year, and we're looking forward to doing another one in 12 months' time. Thank you very much.
Fingers crossed. Thank you.